It's also been a year of wins for Indian diplomacy. You don't expect the Western media to cover it. They see India with a lens of bias. But we had you covered. Back in June, we travelled to Washington, D.C. Prime Minister Modi was there for a state visit, his first since taking office. Then you had the G20 Summit here in New Delhi. Dozens of world leaders descended on the national capital. Once again, you saw it here. The big interviews, the key developments and the inside details of India's diplomatic manoeuvring. Our goal was quite simple. Explain Indian diplomacy from an Indian perspective. We hope we've done that in the past 1 year. Here's a look at India's biggest diplomatic wins. So the last 9 months have come down to this moment, the Leaders' Summit here in New Delhi. It kicked off this morning at the Bharat Mandapam, a newly constructed sprawling building in the heart of the national capital. The place is buzzing with action right now. World leaders, diplomats, journalists, the who's who of the world, all gathered at the center of New Delhi. It is what many call the Met Gala of diplomacy. Prime Minister Modi gave his opening remarks. He invited the African Union's president to join the round table. Look at this.
आगे की कार्रवाई शुरू करने से पहले मैं अफ्रीकन यूनियन के अध्यक्ष को G20 के स्थायी सदस्य के रूप में अपना स्थान ग्रहण करने के लिए आमंत्रित करता हूं। एक्सेलेंसी,
This summit is a huge win on 2 counts. One, the ability to host such an event. We're talking about complicated logistics here. Dozens of leaders, dozens of VVIP jets and motorcades. A lot can go wrong in such situations, but India has pulled it off. It's a huge learning curve for the country and for its people. And number 2, the definition of the India way. What does that mean? We know there is an American way. Meddle too much, preach a lot. We also know there is a Chinese way, ignore opinions, force your will. But India has demonstrated that a third way is possible. The India way. It has 4 broad steps. Consult everyone, focus on the positives, minimize the differences and build consensus. We start tonight with Canada. It has blamed India for the death of a terrorist.
Over the past number of weeks, Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar.
Indians are being threatened in Canada. The opposition leader is asking for proof. And his allies? Well, they're sitting this one out. The question is why? Because Justin Trudeau is asking too much of his allies. He's asking them to throw a strategic partner under the bus, the world's largest democracy, a country that has never meddled abroad. And he's doing that without giving any proof. So the ball is now in Justin Trudeau's court. He claimed that there were, quote-unquote, credible allegations against India. Now is the time to show the credible proof. Prime Minister Modi headed to the White House. He was welcomed by President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden. They spoke for a couple of minutes. They shared a joke or two perhaps, posed for pictures and then disappeared into the White House. Now this wasn't the ceremonial welcome. It was a private dinner between Biden and Modi. The 2 leaders also exchanged some gifts. We'll talk about that later. So that was day 1 in Washington, D.C., done and dusted. Now let's talk about day 2. A couple of hours back, the Prime Minister returned to the White House. We've been here this whole time, and this time it was a ceremonial welcome. Take a look at how that played out. This is from the year 1994, where a much younger Narendra Modi stands outside the White House. He'd been invited by the American Council of Young Political Leaders. It's a non-profit organization. Clad in a simple cotton kurta, he stands along with some other political leaders, probably oblivious of how his America story will unfold. About a decade later, that story takes an unexpected turn. Modi's visa is revoked in the year 2005. He's banned from entering the United States of America. Why? Over the Gujarat riots of 2002, where he was acquitted by Indian courts but held guilty by the Americans. Like all things, this too passed. Within the next decade, things began to change and change dramatically for Narendra Modi. His political star rose, as did his profile on the world stage. You could say Modi's rags to riches story mirrors the phenomenal rise of India. It is now the world's fastest growing major economy, a digital powerhouse, the most populous nation, and the largest democracy. In January, Egypt's president was chief guest at India's Republic Day. His name is Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. Then in June, Modi traveled to Cairo. It was the first visit by an Indian Prime Minister in 26 years. Now, this relationship itself is old, India and Egypt. But in the last decades, it lost momentum. The idea is to revive it. Egypt is a major African buyer of arms. It's reportedly interested in India's Tejas fighter jet. And before Egypt, Prime Minister Modi also visited Papua New Guinea. It's a tiny Pacific island that's now making international headlines. Modi's visit began on a unique note. Let me show you what it looked like. That's James Marape, the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea. He's touching the feet of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. In Indian culture, you would know, this is a way to show respect to your elders, a way to seek their blessings. But it's not something you see heads of state do in public. So this was a special gesture. But what's in it for India? Well, lots. Number one, a way to counter China and its expansionist agenda in the region. Number two, access to new trade links. Number three, access to vast ocean resources of the Pacific like nickel, lithium and cobalt. Number four, partnership on common goals like sustainable development, climate change, food and energy security. So there's a lot of scope for convergence. New Delhi will have to overcome the tyranny of distance to make the most of it. They've identified key areas of cooperation like clean energy, technology, solar electrification, and India can leave an immediate impact in these areas. The trick is to keep at it, to not let other, seemingly more urgent issues to take over. Qatar decided to cancel the death penalty of former Indian sailors. 8 of them are in prison. They've been accused of spying on Qatar's military, and that too reportedly for Israel. Now, if you know Qatar, that's a suicide mission. But New Delhi pulled through. Prime Minister Modi spoke to Qatar's emir at the COP28 summit. Indian diplomats were constantly offering consular support, and yesterday the good news came. It's not a big bang success like the G20, but it's proof of mature and behind-the-scenes diplomacy. India will need that going forward. So looking back, 2023 was a good year in diplomacy. The highs clearly outweigh the challenges.